Trick number 1. The extension. It is a question of taking up the opposing thesis by extending it beyond its natural limits, giving it as general and broad a meaning as possible and exaggerating it, while maintaining the limits of its own positions as restricted as possible. Because the more general a thesis is, the easier it is to attack it. To defend oneself against this strategy consists in formulating a precise proposition on the controversial status. Example 1. I say, the English people are the best in regards to dramaturgy. My opponent then tried to give an instance to the contrary and replied, it is well known that the English are not gifted in music and therefore in opera. I refuted the attack by refreshing his memory. Music is not part of the dramaturgy, which only includes tragedy and comedy. My opponent probably knew this but had tried to generalize my point to include all theatrical performances and therefore opera and therefore music in order to mislead me on my thesis. Conversely, it is possible to defend one's positions by further reducing the limits within which they initially apply, as long as our formulation helps us to do so. Example 2 said, the peace of 1814 gave all the German towns of the Hanseatic League their independence, and B gives an instantia in contrarium by recalling that Danzig had received its independence from Bonaparte and had lost it by this peace. To escape, I said all the German cities of the Hanseatic League. Danzig was a Polish city. Example 3. Lamarck, in his zoological philosophy, rejects the idea that polyps can experience sensations because they lack nerves. However, it is certain that there is a sense of perception in them. They orient themselves in the direction of the light by moving from tentacle to tentacle and can seize their prey. It was therefore hypothesized that their nervous system extended through their whole body in equal measure as if they were fused with, since it is evident that polyps possess the faculty of perception without exhibiting sensory organs. As this theory refutes Lamarck's argument, he resorts to dialectics. In this case, all parts of the body of the polyps must be capable of all sorts of perception, movement, and thought. The polyp would then have at each point of its body all the organs of the most perfect of animals. Each point could see, smell, taste, listen, etc., or better, to think, to judge, to draw conclusions. Each particle of his body would be a perfect animal, and the polyp would be above man, because each particle of his body would have all the capacities of men. Besides, there would be no reason not to extend what is true for the polyp to all monads, then to plants, which are also alive, etc. By using this strategy of dialectics, a writer betrays the fact that he knows he is wrong, because someone said their whole body senses light and therefore acts like a nerve. Lamarck extended to the fact that the body was capable of thinking. Trick number 2. Disambiguation. This ploy consists of extending a proposition to something that has little or nothing to do with the original discourse except for the similarity of the terms used in order to refute it triumphantly and give the impression of having refuted the original proposition. Note, words are synonyms when they represent the same conception, while homonyms are two conceptions covered by the same word. Deep, cutting, high to speak sometimes of body, sometimes of tone are homonyms, while honorable and honest are synonyms. This ploy can be seen as identical to the ex homonymia fallacy. However, if the fallacy is obvious, it will not deceive anyone. Omni lumen potest extinguished. Intellect is lumen. Intellect is potest extinguished. We can see four terms here, light, used both literally and figuratively. But in subtle cases, these homonyms covering several concepts can be misleading. Example 1. A. You are not yet initiated into the mysteries of Kant's philosophy. B. Oh, but if it's about mysteries, that doesn't interest me. Example 2. I condemn the principle of honor as ridiculous because if a man loses his honor by receiving an insult, he can only wash it away by retorting an even greater insult. or by drawing the blood of his adversary or his. I argued that a man's true honor cannot be tarnished by what he suffers, but only by his actions, because it is impossible to foresee what may happen to us. My adversary immediately attacked my argument by triumphantly proving to me that when a merchant was falsely accused of dishonesty or bad business, it was an attack on his honor, and he suffered because of what he suffered, and could be averted only by punishing his attacker and forcing him to recant. Here, the imposed homonym is that between civic honor, also called good name, which can suffer from defamation and scandal, and chivalrous honor or point of honor, which can suffer from insult. An attack cannot be ignored. 11 voluntary errors are never subtle enough to mislead, and one must find examples through one's own experiences. It would be a good thing if all the schemes could have a short and appropriate name, so that if someone uses one of them, they can be blamed immediately on the first, which must be refuted in public, and therefore with the same justification. An attack on the second cannot be ignored either, but can only be washed away by the duel, or an even greater insult. We have here a confusion between two completely different things that come together in the same honor, from which the distortion of the debate arises. Trick number 3, the generalization of opposing arguments. It is a matter of taking a proposition relative and positing it as absolute 12, or at least taking it in a completely different context, and then refuting it. Aristotle's example is as follows: the Moor is black, but his teeth are white, so he is black and white at the same time. This is an invented example whose sophistry will not deceive anyone. We must therefore take a real example. Example 1. In a discussion concerning philosophy, I admitted that my system supported the Quietists and praised them. Shortly after, the conversation turned to Hegel, and I maintained that his writings were mostly ridiculous, or at least there were many passages where the author wrote words leaving it up to the reader to guess their meaning. My adversary did not attempt to refute this assertion ad rem, but contented himself with the argumentum ad hominem by telling me that I was praising the Quietists when they had also written many nonsense. I admitted this fact, but to take it up again, I said that it was not as philosophers and writers that I praised the Quietists, that is, of their achievements in the field of theory, but as men and for their conduct in the practical realm, whereas in Hegel's case we were talking about his theories. So I parried the attack. The first 3 stratagems are related. They have in common the fact that we are attacking something different than what has been claimed. It would be an ignoratio elenchi to be beaten in such a way. In all the examples I have given, what the adversary says is true, and he stands in apparent and not real opposition to the thesis. All we have to do to parry this kind of attack is to deny the validity of the syllogism, that is, the conclusion it draws, because it is wrong and we are right. It is therefore a direct refutation of the refutation per negationem consequentiae. We must not admit the true premises, because we can then guess the conclusions. There are, however, 2 ways to oppose this strategy. Trick number 4, hide your game. When one wishes to draw a conclusion, it is not necessary that the adversary see where one is coming from, but all the same to make him admit the premises one by one, the air of nothing. Otherwise, the adversary will try to oppose it with all sorts of chicanery. If it is doubtful that the adversary admits the premises, it is necessary to establish premises to these premises, to make pre-syllogisms, and to manage to have them admitted regardless of the order. This hides your game until your opponent has approved everything you need to attack him. This stratagem does not need to be illustrated by an example. Trick number 5, false arguments. One can, to prove an assertion in the case where the adversary refuses to approve true arguments, either because he does not perceive the veracity of them, or because he guesses where one wants to come from there, to use arguments that we know to be false. In this case, one must take arguments that are false in themselves, but true ad hominem, and argue with the opponent's way of thinking, that is, ex concessus. A true conclusion can indeed flow flow from false premises, but not the other way around. Similarly, one can divert the false arguments of the adversary by false arguments that he thinks to be true. You have to use his way of thinking against him. Thus, if he is a member of a cult that we do not belong to, we can use the cult doctrine against him. Trick number 6. Postulate what has not been proven. We make a petitio principii by postulating what has not been proven, namely, using another name, e.g., good reputation instead of honor, virtue instead of virginity, etc., or using interchangeable words like red-blooded animals instead of vertebrates, by making a general statement covering what is in question in the debate. For example, maintaining the uncertainty of medicine by postulating the uncertainty of all human knowledge, or vice versa. If two things follow from each other and one remains to be proven, the other can be postulated. If a general proposition remains to be proven, the adversary can be led to admit each particular point. This is the reverse of the second case. Trick number 7. Reach consensus through questions. If the debate is conducted in a relatively strict and formal way, and there is a desire to reach a clear consensus, the person who formulates a proposition and wants to prove it can, to oppose his adversary by asking questions in order to demonstrate the truth by his admissions. This anathema method was particularly in use among the ancients, and a few stratagems developed later are associated with it. The idea is to ask a lot of broad questions at the same time, as if to hide what you want to admit. The argument arising from these admissions is then quickly submitted. Those who are not quick-witted will not be able to follow the debate precisely and will not notice errors or omissions in the demonstration. Trick number 8. Angry the opponent. Provoke your adversary's anger. Anger veils judgment, and he will lose sight of his interests. It is possible to provoke the opponent's anger by being unfair to him repeatedly, or by chicanery and by generally being insolent. Trick number 9. Ask the questions in a different order. Ask your questions in a different order than the conclusion depends on, and transpose them so that the adversary does not guess your objective. He will then not be able to take precautions, and you will be able to use his answers to arrive at different, even opposite conclusions. This is related to stratagem 4, hiding his game. Trick number 10. Take advantage of the antithesis. If you find that your opponent is answering a negative to a question you need a positive answer to in your argument, question him on the opposite of your thesis, as if that is what you wanted him to approve, or give him the choice to choose between the two so that he doesn't know which of the two proposals you want him to agree to. Trick number 11. Generalize about specific cases. Make an induction and arrange so that your adversary concedes particular cases which ensue from it without telling him the general truth that you want him to admit. Introduce this truth later as admitted fact, and at the time he will feel as if he has admitted it himself, and the listeners will also feel that way because they will remember the many questions about the particular cases that you will have asked. Trick number 12. Choose favorable metaphors. If the conversation revolves around a general conception that does not bear a name but requires a metaphorical designation, you must choose a metaphor favorable to your thesis. For example, the words servile and liberales used to designate the Spanish political parties were obviously chosen by the latter. The term Protestant was chosen by the Protestants, as well as the term evangelist by the evangelists, but the Catholics call them heretics. The same can be done for terms with more precise definitions. For example, if your opponent proposes an alteration, you will call it an innovation because this term is pejorative. If you are the one making a proposal, it will be the other way around. In the first case, you will refer to your adversary as the established order. In the second case, as outdated prejudice. What an impartial person would call worship or practice of religion would be called by a supporter piety or divine blessing, and by an opponent as bigotry or superstition. In the end, this is a petitio principii. What has not been demonstrated is used as a postulate to draw a judgment. Where one person speaks of pretrial detention, another will speak of locking up, An interlocutor will thus often betray his positions by the terms he uses. Of all the ploys, this one is the most commonly used and is used on instinct. One will speak of priests where another will speak of radicans. Trick number 13, reject the antithesis. For our adversary to accept a proposal, we must also provide him with the counter-proposal and give him the choice between the two, accentuating the contrast so much that, to avoid a paradoxical position, he will rally to our proposal, which is the one that seems most likely. For example, if you want to make him admit that a boy must do whatever his father tells him to do, ask him the question, should we in all things obey or disobey his parents? Similarly, if something is said to happen often, ask whether by often we mean few or many cases, and he will tell you, a lot. It's like putting gray next to black and calling it white, or next to white and calling it black. Trick number 14, claim victory despite defeat. There is a brazen trap that you can set against your adversary when your adversary has answered several questions without any of the answers having been favorable as to the conclusion you are defending. Nevertheless, present your conclusion triumphantly as if your adversary had proven it for you. If your opponent is shy or stupid and you are bold enough, and talk. Trick number 15, use absurd arguments. If we have put forward a paradoxical proposition and we have trouble proving it, we can propose to our adversary a proposition which seems correct, but whose truth is not quite palpable at first sight, as if we wanted to use this proposition as proof. If the adversary rejects this proposal out of suspicion, we will triumphantly proclaim that we have led him ad absurdum. If, on the other hand, he accepts the proposal, it shows that we were reasonably right and can continue on this path. We can also have recourse to the previous stratagem and declare our paradoxical position demonstrated by the proposition which he admitted. This requires extreme impudence, but such cases do happen, and there are people who do so instinctively. Trick number 16, ad hominem argument. The argumenta ad hominem or ex concessus. When our adversary makes a proposal, it is necessary to check whether this would not be inconsistent, even if it is only in appearance, with other proposals that he has made or admitted, or with the principles of the school or sect to which he belongs, or with the actions of the members of his cult, at worst with those who give the impression of having the same opinions, even if it is unfounded. For example, if he defends suicide, we can answer him, "Then why don't you hang yourself?" Or if he claims that life in Berlin is not good, one can retort, "Why don't you take the first express to leave her?" This is the kind of quibbles that can be used. Trick number 17, defend yourself by splitting your hair. If the adversary pushes us back by presenting evidence to the contrary, it is often possible to save himself by drawing a fine distinction which we had not thought of before. This applies in the case of double meaning or double case. Trick number 18, interrupt and divert the debate. If we realize that the adversary has undertaken a series of arguments which will lead to our defeat, we must not allow him to come to a conclusion, but interrupt him in the middle of his argument, distract him, and divert this subject to bring it to others. A mutatio controversy can be used. Trick number 19, generalize rather than discuss specifics. If the adversary specifically challenges us to undermine a particular point in his argument but we see little wrong with it, we should try to generalize the subject and then attack him on it. If we are asked to explain why a certain physical hypothesis cannot be trusted, we can invoke the fallibility of human knowledge by citing several examples. Trick number 20, to draw conclusions. When we have postulated our premises and the adversary has admitted them, we must refrain from asking him to draw conclusions and do so immediately. And even if a premise or two is missing, we can pretend they've been admitted and announce the conclusion. Trick number 21, responding to bad arguments with bad arguments. When the opponent uses a superficial or sophistical argument and we see through it, it is certainly possible to refute it by exposing its superficial character, but it is better to use an equally superficial and sophistical counter-argument. Indeed, it is not the truth that we are concerned with but victory. If, for example, he uses an argumentum ad hominem, it suffices to respond with a counter-argumentum ad hominem. It is generally shorter to proceed in this way than to establish the truth by a long argument. Trick number 22, petitio principii. If our adversary wants us to admit something from which the problematic point of the debate ensues, we must refuse by declaring that the adversary makes a petitio principii. The audience will immediately identify any similar argument as such and deprive the opponent of their best argument. Trick number 23, forcing the opponent to exaggeration. Contradiction and dispute incite man to exaggeration. We can thus by provocation encourage the adversary to go beyond the limits of his argument to refute it, and give the impression that we have refuted the argument itself. Similarly, one must be careful not to exaggerate one's own arguments under the effect of contraction. The adversary will often himself seek to exaggerate our arguments beyond their limits, and he must be stopped immediately to bring him within the established limits. That is what I said, and nothing more. Trick number 24, drawing false conclusions. It is about taking an opponent's proposal and twisting its spirit to derive false, absurd, and dangerous proposals that his initial proposal did not include. This gives the impression that his proposal gave birth to others that are incompatible with each other or challenge an accepted truth. It is an indirect refutation, an apagogy. Trick number 25, find an exception. It is an apagogy through an instance, an exemplum in contrarium. The epagoge, inductio, requires a large number of well-defined instances to establish itself as a universal proposition, while the apagoge requires only one instance to which the proposition does not apply and which refutes it. This is what is called an instance, enstasis, exemplum in contrarium, instantia. For example, the sentence, all ruminants have horns, is refuted by the sole instance of the camel. Instance applies where a fundamental truth seeks to be enforced, but something is inserted into the definition that does not make it universally true. However, it is possible to make a mistake, and before using instances, you must check 1. If the example is true, because there are cases in which the single example is not true, such as in the case of miracles, ghost stories, etc. 1. If the example falls within the realm of the conception of truth, which is established by the proposition, for it might only be apparent, and the subject is of a nature to be regulated by precise distinctions. 1. If the example is really inconsistent with the proposition, because again, it is often only apparent. Trick number 26, turning an argument against the adversary. A brilliant move is the retorsio argumenti, by which one turns the argument of an adversary against him. If, for example, this one says, he is only a child, you have to be indulgent, the devious would be, it is precisely because he is a child that he must be punished, or he will keep bad habits. Trick number 27, anger is a weakness. If the adversary gets particularly angry when a certain argument is used, it must be used with all the more zeal, not only because it is good to put it in anger, but because one can presume to have put the finger on the weak point of his argument, and that he is all the more exposed than now that he has betrayed himself. Trick number 28, convince the public and not the adversary. This is the kind of strategy that can be used in a discussion among scholars in the presence of an uneducated audience. If you don't have an argumentum ad rem or even an ad hominem, you can make it an ad auditors, i.e. an invalid objection, but invalid only for an expert. Your opponent may be an expert, but those who make up the audience are not, and in their eyes, you will have beaten him, especially if your objection puts him in a ridiculous light. People are ready to laugh, and you have the laughter by your side. Showing that your objection is invalid will require a lengthy explanation referring to branches of science you are debating, and the public is not particularly willing to listen to. Example, the adversary says that during the formation of the mountain ranges, the granite and the other elements which compose them were, because of their very high temperature, in a fluid or molten state, and that the temperature had to reach 250 degrees Celsius, and that when the mass was formed, it was covered by the sea. We respond with an argumentum ad auditors that at that temperature, and even well before, around 100 degrees Celsius, the sea would have boiled and evaporate. The audience bursts out laughing. To refute our objection, our adversary would have to show that the boiling point depends not only on temperature, but also on pressure, and that as soon as half the seawater had evaporated, the pressure would have risen enough to the rest remains in the liquid state at 250 degrees Celsius. He cannot give this explanation because to make this demonstration he would have to give a lecture to an audience who has no knowledge of physics. Trick number 29. Make diversion. When we realize that we are going to be beaten, we can make a diversion, i.e., start talking about something completely different, as if it had something to do with the debate and was an argument against your opponent. This can be done innocently if this diversion had some connection with the theme of questions, but if there isn't, it's a brazen strategy to attack your opponent. For example, I praised the Chinese system where the transmission of offices was not done between nobles by heredity, but after an examination. My opponent had argued that birthright more than learning ability made people fit for office. We debated and he found himself in a difficult situation. He made a diversion and stated that Chinese of all ranks were punished by caning, and merged this fact with their habit of drinking tea in order to use it as a starting point for criticizing the Chinese. To follow him in this way would have been to strip oneself of a victory already won. Diversion is a particularly brazen ploy when it consists in completely abandoning the questions to raise an objection of the type, yes, and as you have up to now maintained, etc., because the debate then becomes personal, which will be the last stratagem we will talk about. In other words, we are halfway between the argumentum ad personam we are discussing here and the argumentum ad hominem. This stratagem is innate and can often be seen in disputes between everyone. If one of the parties makes a personal reproach against the other, the latter, instead of refuting it, admits it and reproaches his adversary for something else. It was this kind of stratagem that Scipio used when he attacked the Carthaginians, not in Italy, but in Africa. In war, this kind of diversion may be appropriate at the time, but during the debates, these are poor expedients because the reproach remains, and those who listen to the debate retain only the worst of the two camps. This ploy should only be used for lack of anything better. Trick number 30. Argument from authority. The argumentum ad verecundium. This consists in appealing to an authority rather than to reason, and to use an authority appropriate to the knowledge of the adversary. It is easy to debate when you have an authority at your side whom your adversary respects. The more limited his abilities and knowledge, the greater the number of authorities who make an impression on him. But if his abilities and knowledge are of a high level, there will be few, if any. He may recognize the authority of a professional versed in a science, art, or craft of which he knows little or nothing, but he is more likely to distrust them. Conversely, ordinary people have a deep respect for professionals of all stripes. They don't realize that someone makes a career not for the love of their subject, but for the money they make from it. And so it's rare that someone who teaches a subject knows it inside out, for the time needed to study it would often leave little room for teaching it. But there are plenty of authorities out there that have respect for the vulgus on any kind of subject. So if we can't find an appropriate authority, we can use one that seems like it or take what someone else said out there. Context. The authorities that the adversary does not understand are usually the ones that have the most impact. The illiterate have a certain respect for Greek or Latin phrases. One can also, if necessary, not only distort the words of the authority, but downright falsify it or make them say something of your invention. Often the adversary does not have a book in hand or cannot use it. The finest example lies in this French priest, who, in order not to have to pave the street in front of his house as all other citizens had to do, quoted a sentence which he declared to be biblical, pavent illi ego non pavibo, who convince the counselors. Furthermore, a universal prejudice can also serve as an authority, because many people believe, as Aristotle said, that there is no opinion, however absurd, that men are not ready to embrace as soon as they can, provided they can be convinced that it is a generally accepted view. The example affects their thinking and actions. They are like sheep, following whoever carries the bell wherever he leads them. It is easier for them to die than to think. It is particularly strange that the universality of an opinion should carry so much weight, when by experience we know that its acceptance is little more than an imitative process without any reflection. However, they do not ask themselves this question because they no longer possess knowledge of their own. Only the elect say with Plato, i.e., the Vogus has a lot of nonsense in the skull, and it would take too long to remedy it. The opinion of the public is not in itself a proof, nor even a probability of the veracity of the opposing arguments. Those maintaining it should consider: 1. That time deprives a universal opinion of its demonstrative force. Otherwise, the errors of the past which were held to be true should still be current. For example, it would be necessary to restore the Ptolemaic system or bring Catholicism back to Protestant countries. 1. That space has the same effect. Otherwise, the respective universality of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam would pose a difficulty. What is called general opinion is, after all, the opinion of 2 or 3 people, and it is easy to be convinced of this when we understand how general opinion develops. It is 2 or 3 people who formulate the first instance, accept it and develop it or maintain it, and who have convinced themselves that they have experienced it enough. Then a few other people, believing that these first people had the necessary abilities, also accepted these opinions. Then again, accepted by many others whose laziness quickly convinced them that it was better to believe in it than to tire of testing the theory themselves. Thus, the number of these lazy and gullible adherents grew day by day, because these hardly went beyond the fact that the others could only be convinced by the relevance of the arguments. The rest could then only take for granted what was universally accepted, so as not to pass for rebels resisting the opinions that everyone had accepted. That is to say, people believing themselves to be more intelligent than the rest of the world. When opinion has reached this stage, adhering to it becomes a duty, and the few capable of forming a judgment must remain silent. Those who speak are incapable of forming their own opinions and only echo the opinions of others. Other people, and yet, are able to defend them with immense fervor and intolerance. What we hate in people who think differently is not their opinions, but their presumption of wanting to formulate their own judgment, a presumption of which they themselves do not believe themselves guilty, which they are secretly aware of. To sum up, few people know how to think, but everyone wants to have an opinion, and what is left if not to take that of others rather than forming their own? And since this is what happens, what value can we give to this opinion, even if 100 million people support it? It's like a historical fact reported by hundreds of historians who have plagiarized each other. In the end, we go back to a single individual, and yet one can use general opinion in a debate with ordinary people. We can realize that when 2 people are debating, this is the kind of weapon that both will use excessively. If someone smarter has to deal with them, they are recommended to condescend to using this comfortable weapon and use authorities who will make a strong impression on the weak point of his opponent. For against this weapon, reason is, ex hypothesi, as insensitive as a horned Siegfried, immersed in the flood of incapacity and incapacity to judge. Before a court, one only debates with authorities, those of the law, whose judgment consists in finding which law or which authority applies to the case in question. However, there is plenty of room for dialectics, because if the case and the law do not completely fit, they can be twisted until they seem to be, and vice versa. Trick number 31. I don't understand anything you're telling me. If we find ourselves in a situation where we don't know what to say to the opponent's arguments, we can, with a fine irony, declare ourselves incapable of passing judgment. What you are telling me is beyond my weak capacities of understanding. It may very well be correct, but I do not understand enough and will therefore refrain from giving an opinion. By doing so, you insinuate to the audience with whom your reputation is established that your opponent is talking nonsense. So when Kant's critique of pure reason began to make noise, many professors of the old eclectic school said, "We don't get it," believing that would solve the matter. But when the adherents of the new school proved them right, those who claimed not to have understood anything were at their expense. We will need to resort to this tactic only when we are certain that the audience is more inclined in our favor than towards the opponent. A teacher could, for example, use it against a student. Strictly speaking, this ploy belongs to the previous ploy, where one uses one's own authority instead of trying to reason, and in a particularly malicious way. The counterattack is to say, "My apologies, but with your penetrating intelligence, it must be particularly easy for you to be able to understand anything, and so it is my poor argument that is at fault," and to continue to grease his paw until he understands us nolens volens, that it seems clear to us that he had not really understood. This is how we parry this attack. If the adversary insinuates that we are talking nonsense, we insinuate that he is an imbecile, all with the most exquisite politeness. Trick number 32, principle of degrading association. When confronted with an opponent's assertion, there is a way to quickly dismiss it, or at least cast opprobrium on it by placing it in a pejorative category, even if the association is not apparent or very tenuous. For example, that it is Manichaeism or Arianism, Pelagianism, idealism, Spinozism, pantheism, Brownianism, naturalism, atheism, rationalism, spiritualism, mysticism, etc. We therefore accept two things. One, that the assertion in question is related to or contained in the category cited. "Oh, I have heard that before." One, that the system referred to has already been completely refuted and does not contain a single word of truth. Trick number 33. In theory, yes. In practice, no. This may be true in theory, but in practice it does not work. By this sophism, one admits the premises, but one denies the consequences, and this in contradiction with the rule of logic. The assertion is based on an impossibility. What is correct in theory must work in practice, and if it does not work, there is an error in the theory, something which has been forgotten, and that it so is the theory that is wrong. Trick number 34. Increase the pressure. When you raise a point or ask a question to which the opponent does not give a direct answer, but avoids it with another question, an indirect answer, or something that has nothing to do with it, and generally tries to diverting the subject, is a sure sign that you have touched on a weak point, sometimes without even knowing it, and that you have basically silenced it. So you have to press this point harder and not let your opponent avoid it, even if you don't know where exactly the flaw lies. Trick number 35. Interests are stronger than reason. As soon as this stratagem can be used, all the others lose their usefulness. Instead of attempting to argue with the opponent's intellect, we can appeal to his intentions and motives, and if he and the audience have the same interest, they will join our opinion, even if it was borrowed from a lunatic asylum, because generally speaking, a weight of intention weighs more than 100 of reason and intelligence. This is of course only true in certain circumstances. If one manages to make the adversary feel that his opinion, if it turns out to be true, would cause notable prejudice to his interests, he would drop it like a hot iron bar caught inadvertently. For example, a priest defends a certain philosophical dogma. If he is told that it is in contradiction with one of the fundamental doctrines of his church, he will abandon it. A landowner supports the use of farm machinery as practiced in England, because one steam engine does the work of many men. If someone points out to him that soon transport will also be provided by steam engines, and that as a result the price of his stallions will drop dramatically, let's see what he will say. In such situations, generally everyone's feeling is reflected in the quote, "Quam temere in nosmet legem sansimus iniquam," and the same if the audience belongs to the same sect, guild, industry, club, etc. Only us, and not our adversary. His thesis no longer becomes correct when it undermines the common interest. of the said guild, etc., and the hearers will find our adversaries' arguments weak and abominable, no matter how good, while ours will be judged correct and proper even if they were only vague conjectures. We will be applauded by the crowd, while the opponent will have to leave the place shamefully. Yes, the audience, in general, will agree with us only out of pure conviction, because what will appear to be disadvantageous for us will appear to them intellectually absurd. This ploy could be called hitting the tree by the root. Trick number 36. Confound the adversary with foolish words. We can stun the adversary by using foolish words. This scheme is based on the fact that if he is secretly aware of his own weakness and is used to hearing many things he does not understand but pretends to understand, one can easily impress him by coming out with eruditely worded but unwilling tirades. Say nothing at all, which deprives him of hearing, sight, and thought. This implies that this is indisputable proof of the veracity of our thesis. It is well known that in modern times certain philosophers have used this stratagem against the whole German people with brilliant success. Trick number 37. False demonstration of defeat. When the adversary is right, but has fortunately used a false demonstration, we can easily refute it, and then claim to have refuted the whole theory at the same time. This scheme should be one of the first to be exposed because it is, after all, an argumentum ad hominem presented as an argumentum. If he or the audience has no more valid proof to submit, then we have triumphed. For example, when someone advances the ontological argument to prove the existence of God, while this argument is easily refuted. This is how bad arguments lose good business, by trying to support them with authorities that are not appropriate, or when none come to mind. Trick number 38. Be personal, insulting, rude. When we realize that the adversary is superior to us and robs us of all reason, then we must become personal, insulting, rude. This consists of passing from the subject of the dispute to the debater himself by attacking his person. We could call this an argumentum ad personam to distinguish it from the argumentum ad hominem, the latter passing from the objective discussion of the subject to attack the adversary by confronting him with his admissions or his words in relation to this subject. By becoming personal, we abandon the subject himself to attack the person himself. One becomes insulting, malicious, abusive, vulgar. It is an appeal of the forces of the intelligence directed to those of the body, or to animalism. It is a very popular strategy because everyone can apply it, and it is therefore particularly used. We can now wonder what the counterattack is, because if we resort to the same strategy, we risk a battle, a duel, even a lawsuit for defamation. It would be a mistake to believe that it is enough not to become personal oneself, for calmly showing someone that they are wrong and that what they say and think is incorrect, a process that is found in every dialectical victory. We embitter them even more than if we had used a rude or insulting expression. For man, nothing is greater than to satisfy his vanity, and no injury is more painful than that which is inflicted on it. Satisfaction of this vanity develops mainly by comparing oneself to others in every aspect, but mainly by comparing the power of intellects. The most effective and powerful way to satisfy oneself is through debate. Hence the bitterness of the beaten one and his recourse to the ultimate weapon. This last stratagem, one cannot escape it by simple courtesy. Keeping your cool can, however, be beneficial. As soon as the opponent makes personal attacks, you calmly respond that they are nothing. See with the object of the debate, we immediately bring the conversation back to it, and we continue to show him how wrong he is, without taking into account his insults, as Themistocles says to Eurybates. But this kind of behavior is not given to everyone. The only safe behavior is therefore that which Aristotle mentions in the last chapter of his Topica, not to argue with the first person you meet, but only with acquaintances whom you know have enough intelligence not to dishonor themselves. Speaking nonsense, which appeals to reason and not to an authority, which listens to reason and bows to it, and finally which listens to the truth, admits being wrong even from the mouth of an adversary, and fair enough to put up with being wrong if the truth, was on the other side. From there, out of 100 people, hardly a merit that one debates with it. We can let the rest speak as much as they want because disiper est juris gentium, and we must remember what Voltaire said, peace is even better than truth, and this Arab proverb, on the tree from silence hang the fruits of peace. Debate, however, can often be mutually beneficial when used to sharpen one's mind and correct one's own thoughts to awaken new viewpoints. But the opponents must then be of equal strength, whether in level of education or mental strength. If one lacks education, he will not understand what the other is saying to him and will not be at the same level. If he lacks mental toughness, he will sour and resort to dishonest schemes or be rude. Between the debate in colloquio privato sive familiari and the disputatio solemnis publica pro gradu, etc., there is no significant difference except that the second requires that the respondents is always right in relation to the opponents, and that it is therefore necessary that he skips the praises, or that one argues with the latter in a way more formal, and its arguments will be more readily adorned with strict conclusions.